When I was in G2D, that was the press section of Pershing's army in the Great War, the First World War, I happened to be on the road once, and there was some troops, and they were going back to their trenches again, mind you. And a popular song from home, apparently before we declared war, was "I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier." So they were going back to the trenches and laughing and singing, "I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier." And I wrote that, and I said, this is a remarkable how the American morale, they thought it was a joke, and they were going back to the trenches, and the dumb censor. Now, I mean, I think that phrase it's one phrase, dumb censor. Almost all censors are dumb. And this dumb censor didn't see that it was a good story boosting the morale of the public back home. And he said, no, he said, that may be true, but you can't print that.
George Seldes began his career as a journalist in 1909. As a foreign correspondent, he reported much of what has become the history of the 20th century: the First World War, the infancy of Soviet Russia, the rise of fascism in Italy, and the Spanish Civil War, which exposed the growing Nazi menace. His books brought to light stories that newspapers refused to run, and his National News Weekly, in fact, became a home for items denied coverage in the daily press.
Seldes was the unconventional journalist, a man of independent mind. He was in the tradition of the old muckrakers, like Lincoln Steffens, going back then. And he attacked the big boys from the very beginning when it was most unfashionable to do so. It still is, right? But he is a pioneer as the investigative journalist.
Well, I think that the George's work, and to some extent, I guess, my work, helped to inspire a lot of the younger reporters to infuse a fresh spirit and some crusading zeal back into the daily papers.
On Armistice Day, there were four of us, and we sort of took an oath on the battlefield that everything we wrote from then on, that there should be no Second World War. And then, I don't know who it was, said, let's cross over and see if we can get to see Hindenburg. That'd be the world scoop. Oh, we had some terrific adventures, and we were taken to General Hindenburg's headquarters. He said the war was a stalemate. We were just about to end it. It's like, he says, you have a balance of power, and one drop of water poured into one side of the balance upsets the entire balance. So this small American army, these few divisions of these fresh, young, fighting men of the American army won the war. It was a great story, you see. But its significance and importance only took place in 1933, when Hindenburg gave the prime ministership to Hitler, because the whole Hitler campaign, in which he got all these millions to follow him, we were betrayed, we were stabbed in the back. It was the socialists, the communists, the Jews, the international bankers, anybody. He blamed it on everybody else except the fact that the fresh American army broke the line. And Hindenburg never told the German people that. And also, to some extent, the American army is to blame too, because when we came back with, we were all arrested and court-martialed. Clemenceau told Pershing that he wanted a shot as an example. Well, it so happened that Lincoln Air had a friend whose name was Colonel House. And Colonel House was President Wilson's chief advisor. Air got in touch with him through the New York World, and so he saved our lives. But the conditions were we were never to write the story and have it printed. It appears once or twice that I've written it since in books, but that doesn't change world history. I got into Russia shortly after a so-called treaty had been signed between Litvinov and the Hoover Relief, which was going to feed the Russian children, and it actually saved between 6 and 10 million lives. When I met Lenin, it was after he had recovered from his first stroke, and I only met him for a few hours during a meeting celebrating the 5th anniversary. That's how I met him. Incidentally, there was a dictator with a sense of humor. On that same speech, that same day, he was talking to the people, and he said, well, that was a mistake. And then he caught himself and he said, I suppose at this point the capitalist world will say, well, they admit they make mistakes. He says, well, we all make mistakes. But when we make a mistake, he said, we say 2 and 2 is 5, which is a slight mistake. But when you capitalists make a mistake, you say 2 and 2 is a Roman candle. I mean, this is his way of talking to the people. I mean, for a moment, with serious dialectics, and the next moment, a witty remark. I mean, his eyes, he had smiling eyes all the time. Well, anyway, you know, I once put my hand, I put my hand on his shoulder because I was talking to a little man. And you do that, you know, it's a terrible thing. But and I suddenly realized what I'd done. This man whom I knew, you see, I was in the face of the man who I then knew had changed the history of the world. Nobody, as far as I know, in the press corps that went to Russia carried a camera, but I was always a camera bug. And I got a Leica. And I had it there, and I stood out to photograph Trotsky when someone banged me just as I snapped on the back, a terrific blow, and I turned around and this guy started to curse me in Russian, and I just shook my head, and then he said, "Sprechen Sie Deutsch?" And I said, "Ja." So he said to me, "I am the official Soviet photographer, and I have the monopoly on pictures here." And I said, "Oh, what the hell are you trying to tell me? I represent the Chicago Tribune," or something like that. And Trotsky saw a little commotion, and he said, "Was ist hier los? What's going on here?" And I said, "Mr. Trotsky, this man says that he's the official photographer and that he has a monopoly here." Now, I understood from the Soviet policies, the communist policies, that you've abolished all monopolies and capitalism and so forth. So Trotsky laughed and said to him, "Oh, durak," or stupid, or something like that in Russian, "Get out of here. How do you want to take me?" And I said, "Well, just like you were, saluting the Red Army." And I said, "Oh gosh." At that time, I was a film pack of 12, and I had spoiled one when he hit me. I said, if one of these 11 is good, I've got a scoop because I can get it out. And these people have to go through the censorship. It'll take them 2 weeks for the official pictures to get out. I'll get mine to London tomorrow. And I wrote, if the pictures come out right, this is the underline. Trotsky saluting the Red Army. Chicherin, Secretary of State next to him. Kamenev, Secretary of Commerce. Lunacharsky, Secretary of Culture. And an unidentified officer, the fifth man. Guess who it was? Joseph Stalin. At that time, he was an unidentified officer in 1922. Well, that censor there was the smartest censor I ever saw. He didn't use a blue pencil. He used the scissors. And when he got through clipping out phrases and paragraphs, there was nothing to file. We could send letters through the diplomatic pouch of the American Relief Administration. Well, all I did was this. Dear John, it was addressed to John Steele. I am well and hope you are well, and how is Mrs. John? Things like that. Yesterday I had a very interesting experience. I was down in the Ukraine and I came across the makings of a secret army. And then I described for 3,000 words, my discovery of the formation of an anti-communist army being organized among the dissenters in the Ukraine. I had a good story. By accident, the rumor had spread that some of the ARA officials were smuggling diamonds. Well, they didn't find any diamonds when they opened this pouch, but they found pieces addressed to Dear John or Dear Sam. So they put us out.
I didn't know who George Seldes was. I picked up this book called Sawdust Caesar. I think I liked the title, Sawdust Caesar. And it turned out to be a book on Mussolini and on Italy, written by the correspondent for the Chicago Tribune who was in Italy. And it was an absolutely fascinating, dramatic account of fascism in Mussolini's Italy. And I read the book with tremendous interest. It was really my political introduction to world affairs.
The man who really should get credit for that book is a man named William Bolito. Bolito is a South African journalist. And when he knew I was being transferred to Italy, he says, look, the first thing you get there, this was in 24, Mussolini had been ruling for 2 years, the first thing you do there is try to save any of the documents you can find, anything at all, because this man is trying to change the history of his childhood. He was a radical socialist in his youth. He was the editor of the socialist official paper Avanti. He used to call me caro collego, which means my dear colleague in Italian. In 1919, he was on the Popolo d'Italia, and I was Chicago Tribune, Lincoln Air, the New York World. The three of us covered the uprising at the Fiat Works in Torino as fellow journalists. I was assigned to Italy in 1924. The head of the Socialist Party was named Giacomo Matteotti, and Mussolini ordered him murdered. And he was taken for a ride in a car and stabbed to death, and then it was announced that he had died of a hemorrhage caused by tuberculosis. Why in the world was Matteotti assassinated? He had made speeches denouncing the fascist regime for their dealings with American oil companies. And he had prepared a final speech in which he was going to name Harry F. Sinclair as the man giving the fascist party the money to pass a law giving them the monopoly rights on the sale of gasoline or whatever they made. That was the plot that Matteotti was exposing, and they all knew it was coming, and they assassinated him. All the newspapermen, they had copies of confessions by people named Rossi and Filippelli, who were members of Mussolini's cabinet, of their participation in the murder of Matteotti. And all my newspaper friends said, look, they might kill you if you publish this story, but you'll certainly be deported. The damn fool Chicago Tribune, I warned them, do not print them in Paris. And the damn fools printed them in the Paris edition of the Chicago Tribune, which they got the next morning in Rome. And of course, I was ordered to leave the country. So I packed up and I was in the next train out to Paris. And then we came to the frontier at Modena. While we were sitting there in Modena, you see, I heard in a back car shouts. Now, by this time I learned a little Italian, and I heard shouts of "Dove Seldes?" Now, dove means where is. Where is Seldes, you see? Dove Seldes, and I knew that the fascisti were coming. They either had clubs or they had castor oil. Very clever, because They don't kill you. They beat you up and break so many bones that you live for 3 months and die in great pain. Or they put a pint or a quart of castor oil in a funnel into your system, which tears your stomach to pieces, and you die within 3 months in terrible pain. Well, they were going, I don't know which they were going to give me, clothing or castor oil. But I knew they were coming for me because I heard them yell my name. Well, in the next compartment, you see, there were either 3 or 4 men. Now, 2 of them were in uniforms of admirals of the British Navy stationed at Malta. And I know how British people are, and I didn't want to bust in on them, but it was a matter of life and death, so I knocked on their compartment and I said, gentlemen, pardon me, I represent the Chicago Tribune and I'm being deported, and I hear the fascists are yelling, Dove Seldes, they're looking for me, they will either give me castor oil or beat me to death, and they're coming for me. And they were awfully friendly to me, and they said, well, sit down, because so-and-so and so-and-so are admirals also. They've already changed into civilian clothes. So within 2 or 3 minutes, they had reached this car, and they pushed the door open. They looked at them, and they said, Dove Seldes, looking at the 3 of us who were in civilian clothes. And the chief admiral said, we are 5 admirals from Malta, British admirals. And then he turned to them and he used some cuss words like porqueria, swine or something. He says, get out, you fascist swine, to them. And the moment he said that, they crumbled. And they almost knelt down, and they said, oh, pardon, signore, pardone, signore. And they went looking in the next compartment all the way down to the car. And then, oh my, when that train started and we crossed the frontier.
Italy was the last of 4 totalitarian countries from which Seldes was expelled for his writing. In 1927, Chicago Tribune publisher Colonel Robert McCormick, anticipating war, sent him to Mexico.
So I went to Mexico and came back, and then I wrote 10 stories for the Chicago Tribune. And I said, these are pro and con. You can either run 2 of them a day, pro and con, or 5 of the U.S. viewpoint and 5 of the Mexican viewpoint. And then I went back to the Berlin office. Well, within a month or so, the papers start coming in. They published all the articles I wrote denouncing Mexico, and not one word of the Mexican side. And then I said, well, it's a crooked newspaper and I can't stand it.
After resigning from the Tribune, Seldes wrote his first book, You Can't Print That, which became a bestseller. Since then, he has written 18 books dealing primarily with journalism in the 20th century. In 1937, however, he returned to reporting to cover the Spanish Civil War for the New York Post.
And I remember George's stuff from Spain. We were the only paper in New York that was friendly to the Spanish Republic, and the pressure was very great.
We were outraged in 36 and 30 to 39 by the treatment of Spain by the press of the world. For somehow or other, they were almost entirely united in calling the Republic a red, when there wasn't one red soldier there. On the other side, there were 200,000 troops sent by Mussolini, which was never mentioned in the press. Now that is corruption. Now that's how bad things were there. The word Reds was, actually orders were sent by Mr. Hearst, for example, that the Republic was never to be referred to as the Republic or the Loyalists, but the Reds.
And the attitude of the Catholic Church in those days was very different from what it is today. Cardinal Spellman was very pro-Franco. And the bishops weren't talking up then for freedom and republicanism the way they are now, to their honor, in El Salvador and Central America generally.
My wife and I went to Spain for the Post. And J. David Stern, he published 24 items by us. But at the end, the cardinal in Philadelphia, what was his name? Some cardinal had a letter read in every church condemning the Stern newspapers for taking the loyalist side. And when I came back from Spain, he called me in and he said, well, now I can't run any of your more pieces. And when I sort of put up a protest and talked about journalistic ethics, and he says, well, he says, what do you want me to do? He says, do you want me to keep up the fight and be destroyed by boycotting, or do you want me to compromise and do whatever I can without offending him too much so that they attack me and force me out of business?
I met Seldes after so many years of being his reader, one of his readers and admirers. Years ago, when I was younger and he was younger, he edited a newsletter called In Fact. That was my source of information. In fact, the newsletter of George Seldes played a role, I think, as far as I'm concerned, as far as my development, for better or worse, is concerned.
Total corruption was happening on in those days. And that's, I said, look, this is what we're going to devote our paper to. The first issue says, for the millions who want a free press. I said I want it to be nothing but facts. I call it The Facts Are. And then my wife says, why not simply say In Fact? The idea was we will run factual news. Wendell Willkie, spelled W-I-L, but one L, I didn't even know his name. A power and light man from Chattanooga, Tennessee, has been chosen by the House of Morgan to be nominated at the coming Republican convention. That was my first scoop, my first issue, first day. I had no sooner got started than up to 200 members of the American Newspaper Guild started sending me in items which their own papers were suppressing. And I mean real stuff, like Drew Pearson sending me one of the biggest scoops of his life. Something called Operation Muskox, the secret training of an American army of 250,000 troops in the Arctic Circle. Drew Pearson said, either I'll go to jail or I'll lose my subscribers. You want to take a chance on it? I said, if it's news and you can prove it, I'll publish it. And I did. George Polk had sent me stuff which he thought that even CBS, the most liberal of the three networks, would not issue. So he sent me this stuff and a letter which I published of his. I am now going to see Colonel, I think, Vafafidi, whatever it is. This was the fascist side. And he said, this is a very dangerous mission and someone is liable to get hurt. 2 weeks later, his body was found floating in Salonika Bay, his hands tied behind his back and a bullet through the back of his head. We, as a rule, wanted single subscribers. But the Texas oil workers, they wanted to subscribe en bloc. So 6,000 of them subscribed. They're the people who defeated Martin Dies. I think that's one of the best things In Fact ever did. We did claim 6,000 Texan oil workers, all in Martin Dies' district, solidly vote against him. The vote was 13,000 votes for Judge so-and-so, which supported by the CIO Oil Workers Union, 8 votes for Martin Dies, something like that. We defeated Martin Dies, there's no question of it, our readers. Mr. Bruce Minton was a close friend of mine. He was the husband of Ruth McKenney. They were our closest friends. The four of us were always together. How in the world was I to know that, A, he was a secret, not only a secret member of the Communist Party. See, he was one of their real agents, and I didn't know it. I noticed even from the second or third issue that there were little pieces that Mr. Minton submitted, which I couldn't quite. I say well, I didn't want to say they're propaganda pieces. I said, these aren't straight news. They're think pieces. I don't want them. There's enough straight news. So finally I said, look, I said, Bruce, one of us has got to run this paper. You can have it or I can have it. So he said, well, you run it. Well, this was in 1940, and he stayed on for most of that year, and then he never again. And every time I was accused of publishing something of a pinkish nature, they pick out an item of the 1940 issues that written by Bruce Minton. I said, I couldn't write stuff like that. At the end of In Fact, people came and said, the letter carrier is telling us he's taking the names of everybody who subscribes to your paper. You know, I didn't believe it. People started saying again, I'll send you $100 for In Fact every week, but every week I want it sent in a plain envelope, first-class mail, that no one will know who it is and what it comes from. I will show you a letter from an agent addressed to the FBI reporting on what mail my wife and I received in our home in Connecticut. That proves that the FBI was watching it. Whether they had the house bugged or not, they may have had the house bugged. And then when the circulation, I said, look, I'm now getting down to the 30,000 $5 liberals. I said, I can write an article every once in a while and get published in one of these 30,000 circulation magazines. So I said, well, just go out of business.
Well, it was independent. It was radical. It got down to the roots of things. It exposed big business malpractices that a lot of the big papers were afraid to touch. It was anti-fascist and upheld civil liberties. Those are all very valuable contributions.
Since 1950, in books and articles, George Seldes has continued his criticism of the press. Now, in his 90s, he has begun to receive appreciation from the journalism establishment. In 1982, he received a special George Polk Award recognizing his outstanding achievements in journalism.
Well, the establishment never gets around to honoring a maverick until he's practically posthumous and they think it's safe to pat him on the head.
Many young journalists who probably never heard of George Seldes, but should, of course, have been influenced by him because their predecessors were, one way or another. He gave others, I'd say, some guts they might not otherwise have had.
Even it's on the good versus the evil side, I would not slant a thing. You see, I would not editorialize. I would not let any sense of outrage. I would not write a headline except straight. I have one standard only, news.